Peace. Let's continue talking about Western political philosophy. Um, we quite literally could not be in a more appropriate time to discuss political philosophy. Um, I've said a lot to you all over the semester regarding the need to produce a new generation. Let's just say a new generation of voters. But of course, what we meant by a new generation of voters is we meant folks who would be actually educated regarding at least the basic philosophical structures of our political society. Um, so that's what we're doing in our class. And today's lecture is particularly rich with information. So if you have not read the text, it absolutely behooves you to go ahead and read the text. You will not be able to write the sort of papers that you need to write in order to get a great grade in this class without being able to understand the political philosophy dimensions of our course, and a lot of it, essentially all of it, with the exclusion of the critical race theory stuff that we're going to do, the Africana philosophy stuff that we're going to do. Essentially, all of it comes to a head in today's lecture as we discuss, in general, still, because next week we'll be reading, not next week, but next lecture, we'll be reading, what we'll be reading? We'll be reading some John Rawls. Yeah, we'll be reading John Rawls's liberalism, and we'll be juxtaposing that with Karl Marx's version of socialism or Marxism. And we'll sort of pay particular attention to those two texts as we'll read them in juxtaposition to each other. But today we'll set up the basic structures as these systems are connected and related to each other, especially around the question of what is the most just way of organizing a political society. So, let's do a bit of recap just to sort of situate today's discussion of liberalism, libertarianism, and social philosophy, right? And Marxism. So, we discussed what you will need to understand and call social contract theorists. So, I'm writing social contract theory, right? And what social contract theory is that particular methodology for thinking about the political and philosophical justifications of modern Western society, that particular methodology that involved conceiving of a state of nature. So I'm writing SON, and that means state of nature. And the idea that if we could sort of imagine how humans are naturally in terms of their natural philosophical capacities and aptitudes, much of what we've done throughout the semester in terms of our inquiries and our investigations into epistemology, into ontology, and into morality, has all been about establishing the ways in which this particular being, this is a representation of a philosophical subject, right? A being, right? So we're really drawing a capacity. We're trying to demonstrate a certain capacity that human beings are presumed to have naturally on the board, right? That capacity for let's just say for producing meaning in the world. And of course, we know that one of the ways that we produce meaning in the traditional Western philosophical way of producing meaning in the world is to attempt to produce this a prioristic, um, idealist, real, right? This idealist, realist relationship between the world as it sort of is engaged or perceived and the ways that we apperceive or think about it. So, this idea that we can project meaning on the world in this way that we call true and justified in traditional Western sense, based upon our understanding of a rational connection, even if it's a logically constructed rational connection between our apperceptions of ideal formal natures like beauty and justice, etc., and our ability to perceive those things in the world as linked by our rationalistic capacities that I try to demonstrate here on the board. So, when I draw just this being here with this ability to project in the world, with no context around it. So you'll notice there's nothing situating this being here. There's just a being that can project meaning into the world. The idea here is that there would be a kind of pure rational sense in which we can project meaning in the world. Now, we've already discussed and identified in a variety of ways throughout the semester what's unique about traditional Western political, and not just political philosophy, but traditional Western philosophy in general, is the idea that there must be this formal universal answer, right? Or at least this formal universal nature upon which the answers we construct in human epistemology and human knowledge, right, um, will be based upon, right? So we've tried to represent that by sort of drawing how will I draw it? Well, you know what I'm going to draw, right? By drawing this thing here and this thing here, right? And we've traced all the way back to Plato and Socrates and the ancients, whatever, all the way through the modern scientific moments, right? Where there's still nonetheless a presumption of a purely rational capacity for human beings to know reality, and that reality must have some formally structured nature, right? We don't necessarily believe in the same metaphysics as Plato and these folks again. Although we understand spiritualism and religious thought and etc., there's certainly place for that in our society and our culture. But we might say, especially where the political is concerned, right? That we know it as the separation of church and state, right? But this idea that there should be a rational or an objective basis upon which we organize and govern our society, right? Our political. I'm gonna write political state here, all right? So this idea then that social contract theory then is this thinking about how the rational subject would go from the state of nature, right, in their natural state of being, in relation, and when we say state of nature, you should also be thinking in relation to natural resources, right? Because so much of our political world is about actually owning and constructing notions of justice as they relate to property and exchange, right, and fairness in relations between peoples who would have had the accumulation of certain resources, right? So this move then from the state of nature to the political state, right, in terms of traditional Western philosophy, and we're going to talk about our particular, American society at this point, which means then that in addition to the social contract theorists who would be Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, right? So in addition to just knowing, right, you need to know that these are the traditional theorists who use this particular methodology for answering that question about what is the philosophical justification for our state. Excuse me. Um, we're gonna focus on, right, in addition to just knowing that these are the social contract theorists traditionally, we're gonna focus on Locke, right? And the reason we're focusing on Locke, at least in terms of our society, is because, as you would have read in our text, his ideas were the philosophical impetus, as it were, for the, or at least his ideas, heavily influenced and really got popping the American Revolution. Especially his ideas around the natural autonomy that human beings have regarding their own determinations, right? What we call liberty, right? So Locke's notion of liberty being something that we sort of understand even in a state of nature, but that we sort of need to develop a society or a political, a political organization, a government, excuse me, to enforce, right, or to make legitimate, right, to make political, right. So the idea, though, for Locke, though, is that in a state of nature, um, I'm gonna write Locke over here too because we're gonna talk about Locke's society and Locke's state of nature. So the idea is that in Locke's state of nature, right, there's um there's a natural sociality, right, and there's natural rights and natural understandings of property, right. So we're gonna write natural rights, property, um, and we're gonna also write body here, right? Now, all these things we discussed in our last lecture, right? But the idea is that there's a natural right that we have to our own determinations, right? Regarding, our projections, but in particular our body and our ability to sort of transfer our natural autonomous right to our body onto certain objects materially in the world. But what this also means is that there is an abundance of resources. All right, that says abundance of resources. There's an abundance of resources in Locke's state of nature, right? And so the idea is that each person is naturally free, right? So I'm going to write natural freedom. All right, each person is. I probably should have put in. Yeah. So each person is naturally free to go about procuring as much of the abundance of resources that are there naturally as one can, right? And there's specific internal sort of like a priori, naturally, purely reasoned guidelines and understandings that would lead one to sort of all agree, or the idea is that folks would sort of naturally understand the state of nature, that um you are to procure resources and accrue and acquire property, but only to the extent that one actually takes what one needs, right? But then there's a sort of caveat that you would have seen as you read the text, right? That says, we can sort of appropriate things according to our needs as long as we're leaving enough for other people. So the idea then is that one may take more than one could actually use, like, in the moment or something like that. But there still might be this justification for, say, transferring your property over to your children and things like that, right? Only though to the extent that one leaves enough resources for others, right? So there's this caveat here that you might see opening the way for the kind of capitalistic liberalism that we have in our society that says that there's a basic fairness that we understand, but within that is a caveated way in which we can still sort of pursue acquisition, right, and upward mobility in terms of property and ownership, right? So of course, then for Locke, there's a kind of natural morality, right, or natural freedom in the state of nature. In the state of society, then, right, we would then move to political, right, or let's actually call them what we would call them liberal, right? And we don't mean, right at this point, we're not talking about liberal in the sense of democratic or left wing or anything like that, right? We just mean that one would be establishing one's rights of liberty, right, based upon our natural or our civil rights of liberty based upon our natural understanding of our constructions of liberty. And just think about what liberty is. It's your right to pursue, right, your natural freedom to pursue, in relation to the resources that are around you. And your right to sort of own what you've acquired is based upon your right to your body, right? And you having sort of transferred this natural right that you have to your body over to some object, and we call that labor, right? This idea that you actually farm a piece of land, so that land becomes yours, right? So this notion then that you would then construct your liberal rights, right, where you can now have liberal notions of property, right? And we could even talk about the liberal rights one has to one's body, right? So when I say the liberal rights you have to one's body, what I mean is we could then, list, right, what you'll see in terms of our discussion of John Stuart Mill as we turn the pages in a few seconds. You'll see this idea that we have what you could think of as positive and negative rights, all right? So let's do this like this. No, let's do liberal rights here, and then we'll sort of just go down and say that what you have then are positive and negative rights, right? Where your positive rights are your rights for freedom and liberty, right? And your negative rights are your rights to not be, let's call it, what I'm trying to describe is not have your liberty impinged upon, right? So let's say not have liberty denied, right? Not have liberty and freedom denied. All right. So the idea then is this, right? So for Locke, we have liberal rights that are based upon our natural understandings of our natural rights, right? And in a liberal society, then the government's only job is to enforce, right, these rights that are already constructed naturally or understood naturally in a state of nature. So you would have essentially rights, and just think about how our rights work in our society, right? You could think about them in terms of two broad categorizations of negative liberal rights and positive liberal rights. Negative doesn't mean bad here; it just means that you have a right to not have certain things done to you, right? And then your positive rights mean that you have a right to go out and do certain things, yeah. And so you can imagine then that the only gray area really is to just say that one is allowed, ought to be allowed to pursue all of one's positive rights so long as you're not violating anyone else's negative rights. Do you see? Do you get the point there, right? So there's a sort of inherent freedom and liberty, especially as it relates to property and acquisition and deal making and contract making and all of the accoutrements that we typically associate with capitalism, right? As long as there's this basic understanding that we don't that we know naturally we cannot violate anyone's negative rights, right? And so the idea then is that you would construct a liberal government, right? And the government's job is to enforce these positive and negative rights, right? So you can imagine then that there would be a potential for a divide, right, between what we know now, what we would call let's call them, well, they're liberals, right? But this is liberals in the sense that you would understand them today in terms of the left and the right. So let's actually put this on the left and the right. So we put the liberals then, all right, over here, right, in terms of liberalism, right? That says liberalism. I'm sorry, I'm gonna try to write that a little bit more neatly. So there's liberalism, right? And then there's libertarianism. Okay? So these are the two camps as we understand them today, right? And this would be like, your left democratic and further you go, I guess the more socialist you go. And then the libertarian would be the sort of small government, or in your text you see the minimalist state position, right? But for our purposes, what you need to understand about the traditional structures of Western philosophy, right, is as you can see here, our major political philosophical orientations in our society, right, between these two poles here, right, are nevertheless organized and centered on this question of whether or how our government ought to best enforce, right, our positive and our negative conception of liberal rights, right? So you can sort of already imagine, and we're gonna switch to the text in a second. You can sort of already imagine, from your basic sort of everyday experiences with, the left and the right, and maybe, just different family members, or just, being party to certain debates on TV or these sorts of things. You can already sort of imagine where, the left, or, let's write Rawls here because this is John Rawls that you're going to be reading, right? People like Novak, I think your book mentions over there. Well, we may need to correct that. Let me actually just double check really quick. I think Novak is mentioned and someone else in the minimal state section. So let me just double check that there. That's the social philosophy section. That's John Stuart Mill and Marx. Give me 1 second, y'all. Minimal state. There we go. So yeah, Nozick. I said Nozak. It's Nozick, right? Do we mention anybody else in this section? No, Nozick is gonna suffice, isn't he? Yeah. So, let me write this more neatly. But you should understand then that the libertarianist position, right, is the minimal state position, and the liberalism position, I think is actually called that, but it's the Rawlsian position. And we're actually gonna read some Rawls in our next lecture, and we're gonna read some Marx, right? So there's also, there's Western political philosophy, right, in its traditional sense, and then there's social philosophy, or social critiques of traditional Western philosophy, right? And it's over here that let's move Rousseau from with the traditional folks, because he's not, he wrote and lived, in the time where they were still sort of using this methodology. So Rousseau does count as a social contract theorist, right? But it's important to understand Rousseau as distinct from Hobbes and Locke in terms of their sort of understanding, especially regarding this concept here of the human being in the state of nature. Um, Hobbes, we sort of already dealt with last week, and we only used Hobbes for the purposes of um, juxtaposing our Locke's liberalism with sort of Hobbes's almost Machiavellian sort of risk that the despotic risk that the Leviathan exposes us to. But clearly, for Locke, right, we can recognize that in our own society, whether it's through our liberalist view or libertarianist view that we'll talk about. This notion, though, that we have certain natural rights, and these rights are founded upon everything that we understand about the human being regarding our philosophical capacities that are here, and how all of that sort of transfers itself in terms of our relationships to our body, other people, freedoms, natural freedoms and liberties, and of course, in relation to resources and property, right? So our liberal rights then essentially are to life, liberty, right, and happiness. All right. So that should all be very recognizable for us. Now, what we're gonna do now, that's sort of just a recap with a little bit of foreshadowing here at the end. What we're gonna do now is we're gonna talk about Rousseau, a little bit more in depth, and that'll situate our discussions of liberalism, libertarianism, and Marxism. Let me keep this over here. So, as you know, Rousseau, right, he's a traditional, or he's a social contract theorist, right? So Rousseau also sort of thinks about the state of nature and the current or the modern European state in terms of man's natural being. But as you know, from reading, Rousseau, right, has a very different sort of rendering or understanding of human beings. And the way that I demonstrate that now is to say that Rousseau, of course, understands our, rationalistic a priori capacities for projecting meaning in the world. But Rousseau also argues that society constructs a kind of, let's call it a lens, right? Or a kind of perspective, right? Socially, right? Society can condition a certain way of looking at things that influences our abilities to project meaning. And in very important ways, Rousseau would argue to even have and produce certain kinds of empathy for other people, right? He thinks that the story that's told in traditional social contract theory, let's just take Locke's version, where all human beings are basically rational and fair and etc. They all just sort of freely go about acquiring property. Um, what Rousseau is concerned about is the kind of ways in which certain inequalities may abound in the state of nature, right? In terms of how people get and acquire this original state of property, right? And that there's then this sort of move where the people who've been able to acquire property in a state of nature, right, they then go about creating laws or creating the state of society, right, to effectively ensure that they keep possession of the certain inequities and inequalities that abounded in the state of nature. So for Rousseau then, let's switch over from Locke to Rousseau. Yeah, for Rousseau then, there's a state of nature, but we'd have to talk about it in terms of its naturalized way, right? The way that sort of involves that story we just discussed, where there may be natural or inequities that abound in the state of nature. And then for Rousseau, we have to talk about moving then from the state that's produced in that capitalist way, right? Where we're all sort of creating inequities that we justify at the level of the state organization. We have to then talk about um, how to move from this capitalistic state, right? So I'm gonna draw a dollar sign right there. You know what? I've got a green marker. So how cool would that be? To say that for Rousseau, right? Oh, the green marker doesn't work. Yes, it does. It barely works. There we go. The green marker is needing a second to kick in. You can barely see that, can't you? Yeah, sorry, folks. I thought I was gonna get cute with the green marker. I guess I'm not. I'm gonna switch it back to the red, to the black. So for Rousseau, then you'd have this sort of capitalistic state that's based upon inequalities that accrue at the state of nature, And then for Rousseau, you have to then talk about how we could then go from a capitalistic state to a social state. I should say social. Sorry, these markers aren't as sharp as they could be. All right. So for Rousseau, there are actually two social contracts. There's a naturalized social contract and a normative social contract. The naturalized one, all right, would be, let's write naturalized here. And then let's write normative over here. All right. The naturalized contract would tell us how we got to our current state of justified inequality, according to Rousseau. When I say justified inequality, I mean Rousseau thinks it's unjustified, but he thinks that there's been a kind of legal um, a legal mechanization, right, or mechanizing, a legal mechanizing of a kind of natural or of inequality that was produced in the state of nature. So for Rousseau, in the state of nature, right, human beings are uh, human beings are naturally social, right? And they're governed by love, by self love, in a world that's abundant with resources, right? So you've got an abundance of resources for Rousseau, right? You've got what is called amour de soi, right? So let's just call it self love. I'm gonna call it self amour. And the reason I want to sort of distinguish it, right, is because let's even put that in red there. So that says self amour, right? AMOR. And the reason we want to distinguish it, right, is because it's he's not talking about the kind of self love, right? This individualistic sort of desire for accumulation that occurs on this side of the board. For Rousseau, he's talking about the kind of existential notion of self that looks at human being or the human species, right, in terms of the red box, right, like how we're all situated. So it presumes that we're all, alike at the basic level of capacities for producing meaning, especially where rationality and these things are concerned, right? But it talks about an ability to sort of think about the prospect of goodness and the prospect of truth and etc., not only in terms of this particular traditional European way, right, where truth is only about some individual relationship that a person has, right, and then you just kind of transfer it over to other people in terms of this sort of positive and negative situating of rights, where there are limits, right, but the limits are basically meant to enforce everyone's individual abilities to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Notice that there's no context here, right, in terms of how one even perceives truth or engages truth. It's just kind of presumed that we're already naturally free and developed in these ways. Rousseau also presumes that we're naturally free, right, and that we're all equally rationally developed and etc. Right, but the point for Rousseau, though, is that human beings naturally in a state of nature are not simply concerned with acquiring property and etc. Right, they're also concerned with love and cooperation and working together and solidarity. Right, but of course, something occurs, right, where we go from this sort of natural love, right, this natural love, all right, and this natural humane relationships, all right. And when I say humane relationships, just think of like sharing, right? So natural humane sharing relationships, right? Think about how children are like so concerned with fairness, right? Like you'd be much more likely to find children who are concerned with equally sharing something among them, than sort of securing, right, in a kind of shrewd adult capitalistic way, trying to secure more for themselves and all. Even when you do find that latter type of child, I think usually that comes from exposure to the kinds of things that Rousseau is talking about, right? The kinds of adult attitudes that ultimately cause kids to kind of be socialized, right, naturalized, as it were, um, into a kind of self-serving, we might say into this, at least from Rousseau's perspective, into this sort of shrewd capitalist. But Rousseau thinks that we don't start off that way, right? We start off in a state of nature. That's abundant with resources, that's governed by self love, where there's a sort of natural virtue, right? So let's just write natural virtues, right? Let's just write virtues here, right? There are natural virtues, right, that he thinks transcend this sort of philosophical understandings of property and etc. But of course, we don't stay in the state of nature. What ultimately happens is that we sort of fall into society for Rousseau. Now, I just thought of another dope way of representing this. So I'm not going to change it up at all. I'm just going to draw it slightly differently. For Rousseau, we kind of fall into a state of capitalistic society, right? Where what happens is, there is, how should we put it? There's social distinction, right? And there's property, right? And there's capital, right? And the way that we get there is, for Rousseau, is that we sort of fall from our pure humanity, our natural virtuous humanity. Sorry, I think that's my alarm going off. We fall from our natural virtuous humanity. Um, in terms of the cities and societies growing, right? And there being certain divisions of labor, and through those divisions of labor, leisure time is created, right? And it's through that leisure time that folks actually end up acquiring differences, or inequity begins to sort of abound between folks, and folks start acquiring these distinctions in terms of class, right, and differences. And so class, property, these sorts of capitalistic distinctions begin to emerge, right? Just out of the fact that one person no longer has to, provide solely for their own survival, but they're now part of a city or a village or an organization that does this. So now there's surplus, right? And so the idea is that certain people begin, based upon their, positionings in the city, and Rousseau kind of describes nefarious, right, and sort of wrongful dealings that go against this natural self-amour and love for others that we have. Um, but that kind of, conniving, right, would be that kind of fall from this naturalized state of nature, according to Rousseau. Notice that for Locke, it's a sort of elevation out in traditional Western, societies. This idea that we go to our liberal rights and have property and capital and etc. But for Rousseau, it's a kind of fall, right? And he argues then that we would need to construct a second move, right? A normative social contract. So the normative social contract is the one, just think of the term normative as just talking about that which we ought to do, right? Sometimes you may have heard me describe it as an ought that ought to ought, right? So the thing that's purely to be done in and of itself. So this notion here is that what we ought to do then is begin thinking of ways to produce a social state where we could then redistribute, right, the kinds of inequities that would have accrued as we fell into society, such that we could have equality and equity at the level of access to resources, right? But the important part, or the more interesting philosophical part for Rousseau, is the ways that he talks about self-amour, right, and our sort of understanding of the human self and our capacities for love and understanding and these sorts of things that go beyond our rationalistic ways of producing meaning, right? That there are other ways of living and relating to each other in terms of how we produce shared meaning in the world. That sort of natural capacity that actually falls, right, or gets sort of captured or belittled, right, in this capitalistic moment, it's actually that thing that's relied upon to get you back out of it, right? But there's actually a political program then that would be required and necessary for the kind of move, to go from this space to this space, right? And we've heard about terms like revolution and these sorts of things, but you know that's where you might think about Marxism, right? As we're going to talk about it, right? Where there's the communist state of essentially shared resources and etc. But you should understand, though, that it's motivated by a certain understanding of the human being here that's very different from the traditional understanding of the human being here. And the way that I draw that is to just say that there is a context. Let's draw it in red. There is a context for this Western subject here as it's thought of. But that context is not acknowledged by Western philosophy. It's denied, right? Western philosophy considers itself like this, right? And not in a context, right? Rousseau's is an existentialist philosophy because it begins with the context within which human beings have to exist. You see, so the box around or contextualizing um, what we already can presume about human beings at the level of their capacities for producing meaning in the world. So, um, yeah, let's make our way to the text. You've got the basics set up here, and I may fill in some things here in terms of just explaining Rousseau and Marx. All right, and then we're also going to sort of talk some more about Rawls and Nozick. So there are some things that we're going to fill in on the board still. So let me take a sip of water, and then let's spit out some of these details. Okay, so as you know, with Rousseau, there are two social contracts, and he argues that man falls into the kind of society that in traditional Western thought we sort of think that we rise to. Rousseau thinks that we sort of fall to that society, right? And we fall to it through this concept of property, right? The notion of property ownership creates a kind of pride and social roles and class, and I don't have to explain to you your capitalist society. We're all raised in this very same society, right? The more interesting thing is that Rousseau thinks that society, as we said, constructs social classes and is organized around notions of property that are actually dependent upon inequalities acquired in the state of nature, right? So essentially, I don't know if you want to call them the strong or the weak, or however you want to think about it, but the idea is that certain folks are able to acquire more in the state of nature, right? But then those folks then go about the process of creating laws, liberal, we might say liberal property laws or capitalistic property laws, something like that. And that those laws for Rousseau are actually meant to outlaw the use of force in taking back property. So the idea is that there might have been a use of force in taking and acquiring property in the state of nature, but then the state of society, these sort of halves that have occurred in the state of nature, they then create laws to outlaw the very same means by which they would have created accrued more property in the state of nature. So you can see where this notion of self or more comes back in, right? This idea that there would have been people who essentially were vicious, right? Who essentially were thinking from this kind of perspective, right? This individualistic perspective. That's why we draw this red dotted line. Because the idea is that these folks deny that, right? They don't think about others, or they think about humanity only at the level of individual production, right? Like kind of like the way that even when they think about the species, they think about the species at the level of individual productions, right? So that's why we've always drawn it this way in traditional Western thought. But the idea is that that's not the only way that we can draw society, right? Because we can also, or draw human thought. We can also think about human beings as they're produced by society. So notice how we're putting a box, here, but notice how this person can still transcend the box, right? They're still possible for producing meanings outside of their society or that push the limits of their social, right? So we're not talking about being totally determined, right, by one's social, but we are talking about the ways that people are affected by the social, right? So Rousseau tells the story then of force being used in the state of nature by certain folks who then construct society and create laws to outlaw that very same use of force, right? Sound familiar? Yeah. So then Rousseau says what we would have to do is we have to start thinking about a normative social contract, right? Where we can go from this kind of state of nature, which is like a bad state of nature because it's in society, right? But the idea is that we've just created laws to enforce those who are already sort of positioning us in a state of war at the level of, capitalist exploitation, right? So from that vantage point, Rousseau argues, the question is, how do we live together, with freedom, right? But without domination and inequality, right? So that's the idea of, we're born free. But how do we justify these chains, right? Because for Rousseau, these chains would be unjustified, but there must be a way in which we can construct a social. They're still chains to the extent that they're limits of our natural freedom. But, the idea is that we should be able to construct a social state that's reflective of our natural situation. You can see that, here the claim for Locke is that, they're doing the same thing. They're constructing a society based upon our natural situation. You can see the critique of Rousseau here, right? That we've actually gone against our natural sort of goodness at the level of human being and our natural, self-love. And we've gone against that in collapsing and falling into these ways of society. So in order to get out of this for Rousseau, right, the idea is that we have to sort of forfeit the same natural freedoms that allowed us to fall here, right? That individualistic kind of thinking, right? We'd have to forfeit that kind of natural freedom, right? So the freedom in the state of nature, we'd have to give up. And we'd have to learn to begin conceiving of freedom in terms of like how someone who's understanding this box and our capacities for going beyond the box have to start thinking about freedom how someone like that might think about freedom. What we mean is that, you might think of it like this. For Rousseau, we're talking about producing a human being, right, that understands that they live in contexts with other human beings, right? And so the notion is that here, when one raises the question of the good, it becomes a kind of individualistic question where one can simply think about the good in terms of one's particular will, right? Now, think about, I keep putting the quotations in the wrong place. So, one's particular will. You can think about Kant here, right? And this should be very, you can see that Kant agrees that we all have a rational capacity, we all have a particular will, but the goal for Kant was that we should be morally, in any case, we should be, submitting our particular wills to our understanding of the categorical or universal moral will, right? Well, there's a similar sort of thing going on with the socialist or the existentialist sort of way of thinking about politics. But the idea here is that, since individuals understand themselves as in context, right? So we understand that we come in bodies, we come in cultures, we come in worlds that are shared with other people. What it means then is that the question of the good, right, for these people, right, the good would be understood as the question of the general will, right? So just think about how, the difference in terms of when one approaches philosophy and truth and goodness at the level, and now we're just sort of transferring that whole conversation over to the question of, political organization and political life. But when you approach it through this individualistic way, this way that we're all familiar with, because this is the way that our society teaches us, right? That we can all just kind of do the right thing and it's all individually on everyone else to just produce the right particular will or something like that. Notice here, right, the goal of this person from the very beginning, right, is focused upon, right, a general kind of willing, right, a general will. And that general will, right, but is structurally dependent upon the notion of there being others, right? So the idea that there's a box around you, right, that is kind of meant to suggest that, you can be seen, right? We can all be seen by other people in our cultures. I know we pretend that if we just kind of roll up our windows and, the social isolation thing, but, one might argue that we're just being physically isolated right now, that we've already been socially isolated for a very long time in this culture that we live in already, right? We're just being demanded to be physically isolated right now. But this idea that we don't, acknowledge that others can see us or touch us or affect us, or that we affect other people and we, touch other people. So that this question of what is good, right? For one, especially at the level of philosophical goodness and political goodness, might not be in this traditional Western sense, this kind of unilateral relationship, right? Where you can just think in this one-to-one way and determine all of the rules and structures of the universe by yourself. But the idea that there may not be such rules of the universe, right? And even if they were, it would have to be a matter of agreement amongst people at the level of their general will that was particularly the case, and that's how we should order our society, right? Because you can see that this particular way of thinking, it involves, or at least allows for the potential, right, for one to say that only certain groups of people, let's say men, right, or let's say white people, as we would racially recognize those who were writing these things. I already talked about Locke and Hobbes and these folks' racism, right? I told you, I think that Locke owned great stock in like a big amount of stock in one of the greatest slave shipbuilding companies in Britain at the time. But anyway, the point being, right, that one can think about humanity in a way that entails this relationship with others, right? And that's what's demonstrated by the difference between these two beings here. Notice that this being can do everything this being can do. But what this being does in addition is this very sort of, in Western philosophy, this would be almost like talking about ghosts or something, right? This idea that we can talk about existential love and existential responsibilities that we have to other beings, without having to collapse them into these dualistic conversations. And no existentialist is out here looking for the atom of love, right? But we might say that there is a certain philosophical hostility that traditional Western thought presents against what we might describe as our natural understandings and affinitudes for each other at the level of virtues in the ways that Rousseau would have described them. But alas, for Rousseau, in order to sort of get to where we would need to get, we'd have to educate people into producing a general will, right? Where your particular will is the general will, right? And what I mean by that is the way that you think about what is the best to be done, what goodness is in a way that has this structure already entailed in it. And I think what many of you are realizing is that I've explained to you, in quite some detail, wouldn't you agree? How we structurally in our society are taught to think in this way about politics. Which, by the way, how is this working right now? Wouldn't it be a better? Wouldn't we have more hospitals already in place and more functioning mechanisms socialistically in place, right? If we were already, like, I don't know, 10 generations into people being educated in this way, I think we'd have better groups of politicians right now who would have already seen certain needs. But you can see how our capitalist structures so far, because they're dependent upon sort of this way of thinking about humanity, right? It still articulates conceptions of goodness and fairness and justice and all these things, but it ultimately leaves out, I think, this general will to produce something like a good for all, right? And I think, and not just me, but Rousseau, and we're going to get over to Marx in a second, the critique is that what prevents this picture from producing a general will or even a desire to produce a society of folks who are concerned with the general will goes back to this thing right here: money and capital. All right. So, I've covered for you in the text. Actually, no, let me say one more thing about Rousseau, and then we'll get over to John Stuart Mill. Um, the way that we have to go about conditioning people, right? And it would take a few generations, and it would be some serious state government and some serious state education going on. But you'd have to produce people whose will functions at the level of conceiving of goodness at the general level, right? But then you'd also have to have a sovereign, right? This is Rousseau's program. You'd have to have a sovereign, right? Like I don't know, a dictator, right? Who essentially, let's call him a Leviathan, whatever. You'd have to have this person who is going to enforce the general will, right? So of course you can see where in our Western senses of justice, in our conceptions of our naturalistic rights to own property and accrue capital, as we go over to John Stuart Mill on page 365, you can see where that would go against some of the most fundamental philosophical ideals that we hold in our society at the level of politics, especially this idea that folks would be forced at this level of a normative social program, folks would be forced to act in accordance with the general will, even where they may not produce the will themselves. And where we talk about natural rights to autonomy, natural autonomous rights to our bodies and our properties and our abilities to determine ends for ourselves. you can see the obvious divide here in terms of this notion of capital being juxtaposed with this notion of the social, right? The general will essentially being the social, right? So this is effectively the, the battlefield, as it were, right? Um, Now let's look at a few positions. Let's draw out Marx's position, and we won't say the most about Marx because we're actually going to read Marx, and we won't say the most about Rawls because we're actually going to read Rawls in our next class. But we will describe them, and then we'll sort of say the most about libertarianism because we're not going to read any of that. But it's not a complicated position, and you could probably talk to you know, many of our family and friends are, may occupy this position. So you can probably talk to some folks. Not that they would know this kind of stuff about it, but they could probably tell you, things that could then sort of reinforce what we're already learning. But John Stuart Mill, right? So John Stuart Mill is a liberal, right? But the reason I'm not even going to bother writing him on the board is because, you know what, maybe I will. But I'll only put John Stuart Mill here where we're talking about positive and negative freedoms, right? So I'll put John Stuart Mill there. And that's essentially what goes on between pages of 365 and 370, right? You've got a lot of quotes from Mills, and they're just talking about the principle of liberty, right? So, liberal rights are all based upon the principle of liberty, right? And you can see, this principle of liberty here, right? Life, liberty, happiness. It's really captured in terms of this notion here of positive and negative rights. The ways in which we are free to determine, we are at liberty to determine for ourselves, right? Which things we're going to pursue, right? To make us happy or, property or whatever, right? The only limit to that is that as long as we're not violating anyone else's right to do the very same, right? But as long as we sort of think about the fact that we all began with a natural freedom and we all have the same access to an abundance of resources, right? The argument goes for the libertarian, for example, right? That if there are natural inequalities, you can see they will call these inequalities natural because they're like, we're all free to, kind of, it's like the teacher said, it's like an Easter egg hunt, right? And it's like if I come back with more Easter eggs, then, that's not inequality or that's not injustice, I should say. That's just inequality. Maybe I'm a better Easter egg hunter, right? So the idea here is that certain cultures and certain peoples have simply accrued more in the natural world, and that's why they have the capital and the property and these things in our world today. So for the libertarian, the government's only job then is to protect that which has already been accrued, right, at the level of not violating anyone's negative rights and enforcing our positive rights. So that's the position of like a minimalist government from the libertarian perspective. But all I wanted to sort of establish there at the level of at the level of Mills's liberalism, right? It's just this idea that we have the rights and the natural liberties, right, to pursue those sorts of things, and the government ought not to interfere, right, at the level of sort of telling us how to produce our particular wills, right? We have the liberty to produce our particular and individual wills in any way we see fit. The only limitation is that we don't impinge upon anyone else's right to do the same thing. And if inequalities abound, which they're sure to occur, right, it just means that some wills are stronger than others, but it does not mean that there's injustice. So in other words, the libertarian would say, I don't have to like give taxes to welfare or anything really that except like the basics, like a fire department maybe, right? But out in an army, right? But like other than that, we don't have to pay taxes for any of the kind of social programs that might be demanded at the level of, say, a general will, right? Because the idea is we're already sort of free and natural when we acquired these differences, right? So that's not injustice. What would be an injustice from the libertarian perspective is to demand this kind of general will on the part of the libertarian being told how to invest their property and how to invest their capital, right? Or at the level of taxes, like what public services to pay for, right? So that's what's going on then on pages 365 all the way through 370. There's a lot there are lots of quotes. Yeah, so I'm just you know, there's a lot that you can sort of get there. But a lot of that has already sort of been implied and discussed in our through our conversation of property and rights and etc. So, that's the basic distinction then at the level of Mills's utilitarianism. Now, you can see the social philosophy section then being mentioned in your text right on page 370. But as I've said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of skip over the social philosophy section and the liberalist section, and I want to kind of just focus on the minimal state section. Did I lose it again? Give me 1 second. Let me find my right page. All right, socialist philosophy, communism, and then there should be this little on 378. So let's go over to 378 then, and then I'll end by saying a few more things about Marx and Rawls, and then we'll sort of wrap up this lecture. But the minimal state, right, as we've just described it all by Nozick, right? As you can see on page 379, um, it takes Locke's state of nature very seriously, right? And it says that it supports the idea that Locke's state of nature is a place where folks have a naturally endowed right to life, liberty, and etc. Right? So the idea for the libertarian is that only a minimalist state, right, a state that does not demand that people use their capital to support like a general will or taxes or public programs or welfare, these sorts of things, right? Reparations is like a HELL no, right? So the idea that only a minimalist state could actually defend the kind of natural rights that Locke says we have without themselves violating, without that government itself violating those rights, right? So it's viewed as a violation of one's natural rights, according to libertarian, right? The minimal, right? So we're gonna write minimal state here. According to the libertarian, it becomes a violation of one's natural rights, right? Which is the only purpose that government is supposed to serve, is to protect your natural rights, to enforce this principle of liberty. So, the minimal state is the only way of sort of ensuring, the minimalist state is the only way of ensuring that the state themselves don't become the source of violation, right? The source of injustice, I'm trying to say. The source of injustice. That the state does not become the source of injustice by, violating people's rights to property. Because of course, the idea is in that point, that we would need to sort of do the American thing, right? Have the revolution, right? And restore, again, a liberal government, because the idea is that the government would then be tyrannical. So I think you can see what, that particular view, right? I think you can see this person believes very strongly in gun laws. This person is ready and always on watch for, big government sort of telling them how to use their money. Because the idea is that we've all, all Western political subjects, we've all had a fair chance from the very beginning at accruing property, right? So if there's inequity, just kind of sucks for you, right? You should have did better, or your race should have done better, or something like that. Of course, there's no mention of slavery or anything like that here, but of course, you might imagine slavery